Well, thanks for making it through the wind and the rain and for being there with us on worship. If you're viewing live stream, we welcome you too. It is kind of this beginning of this continuation of the Epiphany of Jesus, who he is to the world. And so we're in the season of Epiphany. And in today's lesson from the Gospel of Luke, we remember that and hear it once again and see it in a different light. Kind of the unique part of this story is that it's sometimes is referred to the Sermon on the Mount. We often call it that. But in this gospel, the Gospel of Luke, it's really the Sermon on the Plain. So it didn't seem appropriate for me to be up there steps away from you when I was talking about being plain together. Jesus went down to them and began to teach. Everybody was kind of in that same place together. That's pretty good. That's one of the things about Christianity, that when we gather around the waters of the baptismal font, it doesn't matter if we're, the upper echelon or the lower echelon in the society of the world, that we're all at the same baptismal font. And there's one image that sometimes we use and not as much, but when the caskets come into the sanctuary, oftentimes a funeral pall is used. And so it doesn't matter if the casket's gold or if it's just a simple pine box, as we say, that the funeral pall is over there and all of us are equal in God's eyes in death. We're reminded of the interconnectivity of all of us in the connection one with another because of God's great love for us. Because God created us as we are, and everyone is loved as much and equally by God. Because there's more than enough love of God to go around to all of us. And it never, ever, ever runs out. But Jesus came down in this gospel, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' disciples are all picked. And so they've gathered around, and there's a whole other big crowd. And so Jesus, after a time of prayer and reflection, comes down and begins to teach and heal. He heals them first, heals their sickness and touches them, that they crowd in around him. And then he begins to teach them just a little bit more. He goes in and blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, those who weep, those who are persecuted. Well, sometimes our life, and I would imagine some place in us have experienced that when we feel that we too are in that area of persecution. That when we are poor and that when we sometimes are hungry or even weep because of our sadness. So we can identify with those disciples that Jesus was talking to long ago within our own lives. And we hear Jesus' word to us that we too are blessed in that. But he also offers up this woes. This is kind of the unique twist of Luke that offers up a twist and a turn. Sometimes Luke is often referred to as the upside-down gospel. You think you know what's going on, you think you know what's going to happen in the Gospel of Luke, all of a sudden turns it upside down, makes it different every time. It's kind of the way Luke works, writing to a pretty elite kind of group of people, and it's like, hey, want to make sure that you get this warning. Just a little bit of a warning too. In other places, in the where it's the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying this continues on of who is blessed. There's 8 blessings in those accounts. Here there's only 4 blessings, and then there's 4 woes, warnings. Just a warning. Warning about those who are rich, and those who are full, and those who laugh. And if people speak well of us, there might be a little bit of concern there. Why do they speak well of us? Have we done everything that they want us to do, and so we were able to be manipulated and controlled? Oh, yes, they're my favorite because they're so good. Or is it because we're continuing to live out God's call in our life and we hear God's call for us in the world around us? So there's some warning to that. But it's okay because we too join in with those disciples long ago. And we hear that call in our lives again. But it's a warning for us. Keep the priorities of Christ alive in our hearts and in our life. To try to reflect God's goodness into the world around us. To reach out and love and hope and trust in God's presence. to be able to help us understand where God is in our world and how we can be God's people in the world. You know, if you look around a whole lot, you're like, well, some folks need to hear this these days. Sometimes that first person that needs to hear it is us. Others around us, other people in leadership, other people in the world, those who guide and direct our world and our day-to-day life, could stand to hear a healthy dose of this, the reminder of those who are blessed by God, and the things that come to our lives and to our ears as a warning for us to change our ways, to see with the heart and the love and the eyes that God sees, to help that continue to transform our lives so that we can be better and more like God each and every day. One of the things that I think it's interesting in Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, as best I understand it, is that there is a real sense of the urgency of the present. That part of what's so important in the Jewish life is not the here, the after, the promise of a better life to come. It's let's fix it now. That's part of what God does in our world. That let's make sure that our day-to-day living is actually reflective of God's law and order and rule and way. You know, that's part of being able to look towards God's future, is to be a part of God's presence. That God is already at work in the world, and for us to hear that again and for our world and for our lives. That it transforms the way that we live and the way that we interact one with another. That we continue to journey on in the way of faith. That we continue to grow more and more like Christ each and every day. There is, part of this is kind of this analyzation, and as part of God's people and the world, it's the appropriate uses of the resources that we have. And you're like, preacher, you should see my checking account. It's not where it needs to be. It's not what it doesn't reflect success in our world. But where do we put our priorities with what we've been given and what we do? How do we grow and be more and more people of faith? How do we share the resources that we have as an individual and as our city and nation and state, the world? How do we get resources where truly they are? And how do they reflect God's use and God's call upon our life in the world around us? We continue to seek to be advocates of justice for all people. That we continue to reach out in God's love and God's hope. And that we continue to pressure those who are our elected leaders to continue to reflect. We continue to pray and to hope and to trust in God's goodness. But part of it is that we pray about it and we also put our hands to work in it. We don't just listen and don't just sit there, but continue to advocate and to change in ways in which we can reflect God's goodness into all the world. It is continuation, and part of that which drives us, and you know, if we go at it alone, we're going to get frustrated, we're going to get tired, we're going to get weary. And yet the aligning of our heart with God's heart and God's hope continues to encourage and to energize and to make us God's people at work in the world. One thing I think that I want to reiterate a little bit more is that Jesus did pray about it before he started working with the disciples. That he didn't just all of a sudden, it's like, hey, what do we got to do now? He continued to pray and to seek God's direction and wisdom for the world around him. When we gather, as we worship God in this place and across the world, that we're reminded of the interconnectedness of all of God's people together as one part of the human family. That we know God's work is continuing on and through us and in us as we go forth into the world. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who is, who was, and who is to come.